Climate Change Secretariat, which gave you insights into the last COPs. Very interesting. So thank you very much for joining us today, Payal, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about your latest project at Vera. Leaving you the stage.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope I'm audible, Alexandra.
You're audible, yes. There is a little bit of wind in the background, but we can hear you.
Okay. A very good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for the introduction. So, my presentation today will be on taking a look a little bit more closely on the aspects of demonstration of additionality for projects, and I will be talking mostly in the context of projects that have been submitted to the UNFCCC under the CDM and also under Vera. So I will be talking more in lines with these two established programs, and I'm sure that additionality is such a vast topic, and it has so much of complexities in it. I hope that I will be at least in this short time I can at least bring upon surface the key issues that are required while demonstrating additionality. So I guess there was already a particular slot which provided an overview to our audience on the basics of additionality, but I will just start off the presentation by providing just a simple slide on what actually additionality means. It means that um, without um, uh, without the revenues, the project activity cannot occur. So if it reduces the greenhouse gas emissions below what it would have done in the business as usual scenario, and it is a principal condition for eligibility of projects under most programs, CDM, Vera, Gold Standard, and a whole lot of programs. But I will be basically focusing my presentation on these two programs, as I have already said. So it is also perceived as the emission reductions or removals that occur due to the price signal that is created by the carbon market. So at the CDM, the executive board under the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat has provided a tool which helps project proponents or guides them to assess the additionality demonstration. It's a 4-step process, and I will go into each of these steps later. But this is just a simple flow chart which provides a kind of overview. So the first step is always to identify what are the alternatives to the project activity. These should be realistic, and it should be, of course, consistent with the local rules and regulations. So after the first step is done, the project proponent can it's an either or. So they can either go for step 2, which is you have to demonstrate that the project activity is not the most economically attractive, or you can go for barrier analysis, which says that I am developing a project, I am facing a host of barriers. This could be as an investment barrier, as a technological barrier, or barrier due to prevailing practice. So if a project proponent chooses, they can also go in for both steps 2 as well as step 3. But what is absolutely essential is that whatever step is being chosen by the project proponent, they have to complement the step with step 4, which is a common practice analysis. This is basically a step which is a credible step, and it complements the other step of step 2 or step 3, and shows that the project activity is not a very common practice in the country or in the region. And even if it is a common practice, there are essentially differences or distinctions that exist between those that are occurring in the project. For example, there are other landfill gas projects that are happening, but these are only possible with some carbon revenues, or these are only possible because they have got some subsidies. So that has to be essentially documented. So in this step, I would like to point out that there is a special tool that is there under the United Nations, which says a first of its kind. So if a project is a first of its kind in the region or in the country, the defining of the defining of the boundary or the geographical coverage is very important in this aspect. If it says that, okay, this is the first project of its kind that has happened in the host country or in the region, then the project is exempted from carrying out all these additionality demonstration steps, and it is straight away additional. So I will now, in the next slide, I will go into a little bit of deep dive into each of these steps. Um, so the first step is identification of alternatives to the project activity. So these in this step, basically there are two things that are carried out. One is defining the alternatives to the project, and the second is to check what if these alternatives and the project activity is consistent with the mandatory laws and regulations. So the first is in order to identify realistic and credible alternatives, you would have to see if these alternatives are also providing the same output or services that are comparable with the project, and also the project activity in itself without being registered in any other program if it is feasible. And the third is that continuation of the current situation, that is no project activity or any other alternatives. So each of these alternatives has to be corroborated or correlated with the fact that these are consistent with the local laws or regulations. For example, in a country like X, where there is a rule that landfill gases has to be flared or has to be recovered for electricity generation, then such projects clearly cannot come into for carbon financing in any programs, because it is a mandate. So it is required for these project proponents to to recover the gas. Or to use it for any other useful energy purposes. But however, there is a statement of the level of enforcement. If the project proponent could states that yes, there are mandatory laws and regulations, but however the level of enforcement is negligible or is very little, and hence it is more of a common practice that these laws and regulations are not abided, then also these projects are eligible. And of course, after running through this step one, the outcome is that if the project activity is the only option, then it is clearly not additional. And the outcome would be that after the step one, you would come up with three or four options which provide realistic and credible alternative scenarios to the project activity. So the step two is investment analysis. This is an optional step, but the project proponent is expected to carry out at least one of the steps between step two or step three. Most of the project proponents in the small scale, where the scale of the project is not big, they would want to carry out under barrier analysis because it is a little more straightforward. But if it is a large scale project, then most project proponents would want to have a combination of both step two as well as step three for the demonstration of additionality. So the objective of the step two is to find out that the project activity is not the most economically or financially attractive, because if it is the most financially attractive, then anyway you will invest it, and hence your project is not additional. Or it is not economically or financially feasible without the revenue from the sale of the emission reductions. So there is a tool again under the CDM. The United Nations has provided a tool. It's a very detailed tool. It provides the project proponents with detailed references on how to carry out the investment analysis. So these are usually perceived that this will be done during the investment phase, when the project proponent is thinking about coming up or setting up the project activity. So these are done through different tools are available. It could be a simple cost analysis, an investment comparison analysis, or a benchmark analysis. So these would, of course, there are many other options, but I will talk mostly about the simple cost, the investment comparison, and the benchmark analysis because time is limited today. So simple cost analysis would be when there are no other revenues except from the sale of the emission reductions. One example that comes to my mind is cook stove projects. So, for example, if there is a cook stove projects, they are distributing cook stoves free of cost to the population so that they are displacing the traditional three stones using the non-renewable biomass into more of the sophisticated energy efficient improved cook stoves. Then you are reducing the amount of non-renewable biomass that are being used in the baseline, and it is also helping with the health implications of also the women who are usually using these cook stoves. So in such a case, a simple cost analysis would be more beneficial because here you clearly have, for the project proponent, there is no other revenue. Assuming that these are distributed free of cost, then the project proponent has no other revenue except from the sale of the emission reductions. The second would be an investment comparison analysis. So here, in the investment comparison, basically you are trying to determine that the project activity is not the most financially attractive. So you can have different tools again. For example, IRR, internal rate of return, NPV, net present value, cost benefit ratio, and you could have two scenarios. One is the project activity and one is the baseline scenario, and check that the project activity is clearly not the most financially attractive. So the benchmark analysis is again another kind of analysis that is a tool that is used by most project. For example, if there is a renewable energy project that is selling electricity to the grid, then they are getting a preferential tariff from the grid. Then an investment, a benchmark analysis is deemed to be more appropriate because there are also sources of revenue coming in. So you would have a benchmark that could be like a government bond rate. It could be an internal benchmark, company benchmark, like a weighted average cost of capital. Or in the investment comparison analysis, you could also have levelized cost of electricity generation between, say, for example, a coal power plant versus a more energy efficient combined cycle power plant. So these are the kind of different scenarios that you could have. So, but what is most essential is that the cost and the revenue should be transparently provided in the Excel sheets or any other tool that the project proponent is using. Most important considerations are that the investment cost, the operational maintenance cost, if there are any revenues or subsidies or fiscal incentives that the project is enjoying or will enjoy, or any other tax holidays, all these things has to be very transparently included in the calculations, and this has to be properly evaluated and validated by the validation and verification body. So the outcome of this step two is that if one of the other alternatives has the highest or the best indicator, for example, the highest IRR, then the project activity is not the most financially attractive, which means that the project is additional. So this is again the barrier analysis. There are so it is not necessary that all projects need to go through this investment analysis. A project proponent can choose to go in for investment a barrier analysis, which could be any one or all of the following. It could be investment barriers, it could be technological barriers, it could be barriers due to the prevailing practice. For example, in a region there is a lot of political unrest, or where there or say for example, if there is not a proper developed grid, and a project proponent is providing a solar PV to provide off-grid electricity, then it clearly a barrier analysis citing prevailing practice barrier could also be very apt. So each of these project activities, I will come to the activity details later a bit in the slides. So each of these activities are linked to a proper methodology, and sometimes in some methodologies there are clear provisions as to how additionality should be demonstrated. So of course one would also need to check the context and the methodology. While providing barrier analysis, it will always be good to provide transparent sources, which are mostly relevant, established sources, which are publicly available data or coming from regulators and legislators. It could also be coming in from the sectoral or the expert studies or the market surveys. Most of the time, statistical data coming in from international or national statistical institutions are also very well accepted, and also industry associations and expert judgments are also another possible data sources that are accepted by the verification and the validation bodies. So this is the fourth step, which is the common practice analysis. This is, as I said, this is a credible step which complements the investment and the barrier analysis. It is it is relevant when there are similar activities, uh, when similar activities cannot be observed, which means that it is a first of its kind, where which you can see on the right side in the box. I will come to that in a minute. Um, or it can be also used when there are similar activities, but there are essential distinctions between the project activity and similar activities can be explained. For example, if a particular wind power project has got some subsidies or has got some tax holidays as compared to the other project that does not have, then it can be assumed that it is not a common practice to have a wind power project without a subsidies, and since the project did not enjoy the subsidy, they are applying for carbon revenues. So what I want to emphasize is that there are many steps and many kinds of cross checks that are in place, has been institutionalized in order to ensure that the quality of credits that are being generated, from the project activities are are real, measurable, verifiable, and most importantly, ensures environmental integrity. So, as a buyer, context, additionality, demonstration is has to be fundamental, and that is why uh, organizations like Vera and of course the executive board of the Green Development Mechanism is doing all possible checks or has provided all possible documents in place in order to ensure that the demonstration of additionality for the project activity is goes through rigorous checks. Now, if a project activity is the first of its kind, there is a tool also 23 included in the UNFCCC website, which has to be included if a project activity is first of its kind in the geographical area. And if it is a project activity that is the first of its kind, then it does not need to go through all the assessments that I have included earlier. So it would apply if a technology that the project activity is applying is different to the technologies that are implemented earlier in the region, before the start of the validation or the start date of the project, and if the crediting period is 10 years fixed. So that comes to the end of the four-step assessment process for additionality demonstration. Now, I will pick up some case studies where I think it would be more useful for the audience to understand this in the context of the case studies. So, for a new grid-connected small-scale hydropower project in Vietnam, the alternative baseline could be the continuation of the current practice, which could be power generation by the grid and the input of electricity from the grid. However, with the project activity of a small scale hydropower project, the project proponent is using investment analysis. In such a case, the return on equity for the average energy projects in Vietnam is 12.7%. However, for the small hydro, it is 9.85%. So this is clearly not so attractive for the project proponent, and hence the project would need additional carbon credits in order to meet this deficit. Uh, Again, this has to be complemented with the common practice analysis, which shows that less than or equal to 20% of all the other plants that import electricity to the Vietnamese grid use the same technology as the class of the project activities. So apart from this four-step method, there are also what we call standardized methods for proving additionality. These standardized methods are are provided in a framework, and a project proponent has to check whether the project activity complies with any of the specified uh, points within the framework. This could be in a form of activity method, this could be in a form of performance method, a benchmark method. So I just wanted to give you a fair idea of the standardized methods. These are basically methods or approaches that would standardize the additionality. For example, landfill gas generation from Dominican Republic are now additional. So, if a project has landfill gas recovery in the Dominican Republic, then they are clearly additional because that's what has been already proved that such projects are additional coming from a particular host country, and these projects do not need to go to the whole cycle. So there are also methods that are standardizing the baselines. So, for example, for the South African power pool, you have a standardized baseline emission factor. So these are mainly done for a class of projects, and these are usually done to streamline the additionality and the baseline requirements so that the project proponents can reduce their transaction cost, can improve the project development, have more time, and also allow more scaling up of such projects. They also, of course, enhance certainty for the investors because such project, which would mean that the possibility of these projects going through a review or a rejection would be minimum. And of course, this also increases transparency in the process. So these have been envisaged in the Marrakesh Accords of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, a little bit about the framework. So, these standardized methods framework sets out the rules. So, for example, a positive list or performance benchmark. So, I will come to the first on the activity method. So, these are basically a positive list approach, which could deem certain technologies, measures, or activities as additional. And performance method, you are benchmarking approach, which means that you are setting a threshold for determining the additionality, and any plant or any project activity which is performing better than this benchmark is deemed additional. So in the activity method, I will in the next slides I will provide you an example with such activity which are deemed as automatically additional because it is a part of the positive list. So the project activity is defined in the context of a technology, measure, or practice, and it is there are of course conditions laid down under which the activity is implemented, and there are of course the project activity should be considered under a specific context in terms of the geographic area. There also has to be the explicit determination of the most plausible baseline scenario, and of course, such activities should demonstrate regulatory surplus, which means that it should not be mandated by the local laws or regulations. So. Um, so there are some options for demonstrating the additionality through this activity method. So the project activity is adopted in less than or equal to 5% of the maximum adoption potential. For example, in Seychelles, in a country like Seychelles, which is a small island developing country, where there is a grid-connected renewable energy project, they may be deemed as automatically additional because, say if it's a solar project, because the percentage of the contribution of the solar energy to the Seychelles grid is less than or equal to 5%. So the financial viability, of course, the project has to be less financially or economic attractive than its alternatives. And revenue streams, there is no other significant sources of revenue apart from the sale of the carbon credits. These activity, when the additionality is based on these activity methods, and especially under the positive list, there has to be a reassessment, uh, which has to come up for a period of every 5 years, and there is also an interim assessment every 3 years. So the idea is that, for example, right now under Vera, renewable energy power projects that are grid connected and that are coming up from any other country apart from an non LDC is not eligible, because there are deems that now the uptake of renewable energy, grid connected renewable energy, is high, and there is no requirement for such projects to get carbon credits. So this is to
Okay.
again a signal for the buyers. Sorry, Alexandra.
Yeah, yes, we have almost we are almost at the end of your slot, so we wanted to ask you some questions as well, if
Okay,
that's
I will.
possible.
Yes, I mean, I just have one or two slides, and I think it will be useful for the audience. Yeah.
Perfect.
So this is again the message to the buyers to say that these there are rules in place, and also these are updated at regular intervals in order to ensure that the projects really are additional and also should meet the eligibility criteria. So I will not go through these slides because I think I've touched upon the activity. I will take a few examples of positive list. So I have a few examples of type 1 renewable energy projects which are micro scale, that is up to 5 megawatt. So if the project activity is in a least developed country or is coming up from a special economic zone, and are providing electricity to off-grid small communities or households, and if it is using one of the technologies like solar technologies or integrated wind turbines or geothermal or biomass gasification, are deemed as automatically additional. Under the type 2, for example, energy efficiency, again micro scale up to 20 gigawatt hour if the project is from a specific geographical zone, and if the project activity are usually providing the energy sources or distribution of these energy efficient cook stoves to households or communities, they would be also under the deemed eligible and could apply the positive list. Similarly, as I already indicated, landfill gas recovery, so new or existing landfills are also deemed as automatically additional, and same as methane recovery from wastewater plants under certain specific situations. So there is also the activity penetration rate, which is determined by this formula. If a particular technology is less or equal to 5%, then it is deemed as also automatically additional. So in this example, if I quickly go through, so there are two cases where there is a wind power project from Spain and there is a wind power project from Morocco. Since using this formula, in Spain, the activity penetration rate is already 13%, so it is not eligible. But however, in Morocco, it is just 1.2%, so they could use the positive list. So yeah, so that comes to almost the end of the presentation. Hello, Alexandra.
Yes.
So do I
Hello.
have time for one more slide, or you
One
can?
more slide. Yes, yes, definitely.
Okay,
You can have one more slide, couple of minutes, but then we want to move to the Q&A if that's possible.
sure. So this is the
Yes.
last slide. So yeah. So this is the last slide. So this is about the performance method. So the performance benchmark is again a threshold for determining the additionality. So there are examples, for example, tons of CO2 emitted per ton of clinker, which is an output metric. Then, for example, there could be input metrics where there is in fertilizers, or there is carbon. There is also the sequestration metric, where there is the amount of carbon sequestered per hectare of land. So these are different kinds of tools that could be used for demonstration of additionality. So the executive board of the green development mechanisms, the other programs like Vera are also doing all possible things to ensure that the additionality of the project are streamlined, but also to ensure that the quality of the credits do not really there is nothing to really doubt on the quality of the credits, and the credit should ensure environmental integrity. So that's it from my end.
Thank you very much. It was super interesting. And we already have a lot of questions, which is why I was interrupting you at some point, because we really want to answer them. The first one, regarding step 2, who makes the different investment analysis in step 2, the project owner or external expert?
So
Give us more information on
yeah, so in step 2, it could be anyone. So today, if I would want to put up a wastewater treatment plant, then I would first, as an investor, I would first like to know if I could have if I have the means and the resources to set up. So this would ideally be done by the project proponent, and the project proponent would have to hire a financial expert to carry out this. Of course, if such projects have happened in the past and the project proponent is now wanting to register the project activity under a program like Vera, then there are also consultants who would offer these services.
And they are internal from Vera. The
No,
verification would be
so Vera is an organization that would be reviewing these projects that are submitted. So of course, Vera cannot provide these kinds of advisory services. There are consultants. There are many consultants who would provide this kind of services.
Okay, thank you very much. And in step 3 again, who validates that the evidence provided is relevant and efficient or sufficient?
So there is a whole project cycle process that happens. So a project documents are developed, and then it is submitted. Before it is submitted to Vera or the United Nations, these have to be first verified by a DOE, a designated operational entity, or a validation and verification bodies. They are, for example, I could say TUV TUV Nord, a few LGAI. There are many depending on the countries that they are operating from. So these are basically auditors that they would audit the project, and when they are and they would need to certify that yes, they have audited all these investment analysis and all the baseline and the emission reduction calculations, and yes, now the project is ready to be submitted to Vera. So basically, these are VVVs, validation verification bodies, that they would do these checks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another 2 questions. Who is paying for these different steps? How do you monitor that those practices are fulfilled during the project cycle?
So once a project activity, once the documentations for the project activity is completed, both from the project proponent, that is the investor, as well as the validation and verification body. Say for example, if I would say to not, then this package is submitted to any of the programs that the project activity would want to apply for. For example, they could apply for Vera. So then the team of Vera, that is where we come into, we will check if the project activity really complies with all the requirements and the procedures that are in place. Once the project activity is registered, or the emission reductions are verified, then it is issued. Once the emission reductions or the removals are issued, then there are buyers who will buy these credits, and that's when you get the revenues. So at the initial stages, how unfortunately the project proponent would need to pay for all these.
Okay, that's clear. And is there a yeah?
So I would just like to highlight, so if the project proponent, for the project proponent, the most important cost considerations would be if they are hiring a consultant, for developing the project documents, and secondly, if the mandatory requirement of having or appointing a validation and the verification body VVV, and then when they are submitting the project to either the to Vera or any other programs, they would need to pay some fees. So these are the main important costs.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. And the last question here from the comments, is there a qualitative assessment and co-benefit evaluation above the financial viability? And how do you take into account revenue streams linked to those co-benefits?
So I'm not very clear about the question. I assume that the question is coming in the context of sustainable development goals in terms of the core benefits. So a country has to go in for a host country approval. So, for example, if there is a project that is submitted, for example, from India, then the Indian Ministry of Environment and Forest has to certify that the project meets the criteria of economic, environmental, and social well-being under the CDM. Under Vera, for example, there is an ongoing mechanism to check if the project is delivering on the SDGs, or is delivering on the indicators of economic, social, and well-being. There is also an ongoing process where it has to check that how is the project activity really bringing in a lot of benefits to the stakeholders that are involved in the project. So there are mechanisms in place. Of course, in terms of revenues, I think I'm not very clear of these questions. But if it is a cook stove project where the cook stoves are distributed free of cost to the end users, there is no revenue sharing option with those end users, because it is because the project proponent here is carrying out everything free, is providing the cook stoves or the equipment free of cost. So the revenue sharing is between the buyer and the project proponent, and the in terms of the benefits that the end users are receiving are free service, free operation and maintenance of the cook stoves, and replacement of cook stoves if there are any faulty ones.
Mhm. Okay, thank you for this answer. I think it's clear. If there's anything else, the participants can still reach out to you during the networking session. So thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time, so I need to move on to the next speaker. But again, thank you for joining us today and for the very interesting presentation. Thank you, Payal.
Thank you, Alison.
So I have to thank you. And now I welcome David Mazaira from the Climate Finance team of Responsibility